You want the card, raise your hand.
If anybody came in a few minutes late and didn't get a challenge coin, just hit me up at the end of this and I'll be happy to hook you up with some because I brought plenty for everybody. All right, so thanks everybody for being here. We're continuing on with the series. Tonight's going to be a little bit of a civics course. So if everybody enjoyed American history and civics, that's kind of where we're headed. Ground rules, just like we've talked about before, right? So we're all here to learn. We're not here to argue amongst each other. I always welcome comments. Just make sure that the comments that are given, that we listen before we respond, and that we're speaking truth. Okay, and it's okay to disagree with each other. We're just going to do it respectfully if there are things that we disagree with, right? Because the Bible calls us to be peacemakers. So let's start out with a little bit of an icebreaker with who keeps the peace. Okay, no voting paddles today. Essentially, I'm going to give you some statements, and what I want to know is I'll ask you if you think this, is more towards government, or if you think this is more rooted in gospel, okay? So, peace comes when everyone obeys one strong leader. Do you think that's government? Everybody who thinks that's more of a government-regulated thing, raise your hand. If you think that's rooted in the gospel, raise your hand. Ooh. All right. Peace means that no one disagrees publicly. Raise your hand if you think that applies to government. All right. How about if it applies to the gospel? All right. Peace is when everyone has the same outcome, right? So equality. Is that rooted in government? Or is that rooted in gospel? Peace means the majority decides right and wrong. Is that rooted in government, or is that rooted in the gospel? All right, and for the last one, peace means everyone feels safe from judgment. We say that's rooted in government or rooted in the gospel. All right, so when we talk about peace coming when everyone obeys one strong leader, okay, what the gospel tells us actually is that true peace comes when our hearts obey Christ the King, right, as mentioned in John 14. It's okay to disagree, and we talked about this just a few minutes ago, as long as we, are respectful about it. Peace doesn't mean that no one can disagree publicly, right? Ephesians 4:15 tells us that real peace just includes that we speak truth in love, right? So it's okay to disagree with someone as long as when you're talking to them, you're coming to them in kindness and in love, and you're speaking the truth to them, right? That's what we talk about whenever we are trying to profess our faith to people and trying to influence them as to why we believe what we believe, right? When it says peace is when everyone has the same outcome, that's more of a government thing than it tends to be in the gospel, right? So we know that God does value justice and generosity, but it's not the forced sameness, right? So, if we look up 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, like I said, we want for there to be equality amongst people and for everybody to have the things that they need, but it's to be a voluntary thing, right? We're voluntarily supposed to help each other and to love each other, not the government imposed restrictions on us to force us to do that, right? Because then it's not as genuine as when it comes from our heart. And I think we all know that, the majority deciding what's right and wrong, that's never the case, okay? So truth is not up for a vote, and the Bible tells us that if we look in Isaiah chapter 5. However, it says, peace means everyone feels safe from judgment. Well, we all know that at some point in time that we're going to be judged for what we do, right? So true peace comes from being able to repent and have grace, which is what we learn when we're in the Bible. So let's talk about some different forms of government tonight, and then we'll kind of focus in on a couple of them that tend to be really prevalent in today's culture and society, especially when folks are talking about differences in political opinions, right? So we'll start with, the singular, so the monarchy, right? So that's when you have rule by one. So you have all of your power that's centralized into a single ruler, right? And that single ruler is often the one who will justify, that they have some kind of divine right, so that the decisions that they make are, given to them by God, okay? So who remembers, and we're going to go back to Samuel, right? There was a time when the Israelites didn't have a human king, right? And so they all kind of followed along under God's law. And then at one point in time, the Israelites came to Samuel and said, you know what? We want a human king just like all the other nations, right? And so, God warned Israel that kings would oppress them. And yet, you had the blessing of some righteous rulers who can serve underneath his authority. Monarchies tend to offer stability within a country for the most part, right? They have the right to kind of suppress reform, any kind of revolution until it just overwhelms a country when you have just a total revolution of things that are happening when folks don't agree. And so it does for a lot of countries, for their citizens, tends to bring that sense of peace in that they have one person that is making all of the decisions, right? But even when we go back and we look in the book of Exodus, right? Remember whenever Moses was having to make all of the decisions, right? And so all the different quarrels that were happening amongst the Israelites, his father-in-law Jethro came to him and said, you know what? You need to appoint, right, wise men to help take some of this off of your plate, right? So learning to delegate, so that not every decision had to come through Moses, but only the most important, right? And so not only is it helpful to have authority spread out, okay, because you don't want one person necessarily making all the decisions, but because it can also help as far as the government goes so that not one person, okay, gets burned out, okay? So somebody tell me, what's an oligarchy? Can anybody define an oligarchy for me? Some people will say that our country actually is, by proxy, an oligarchy. So oligarchy means rule by a few, okay? And so it's when you have a very small elite group, whether it's based on wealth or power, that are actually ruling a country. And so if you go way back in ancient history, it's kind of, everybody remembers Sparta, okay? So Sparta had a council of elders and they ruled. A modern example would be Russia, how there's this, oligarchic influence that happens. And even in, the U.S. today, you will find that a lot of people believe that, what influences the decisions and the elections and the things that we have going on in this country is who has the most money, right? Who's lobbying the most for these decisions to be made, for these laws to be enacted. And so, the scripture tells us, when we look in James chapter 2, that we're not supposed to play favorites and we're not supposed to have that partiality. And so when you have an oligarchy, yes, you may end up with efficient decision making by experts, but you get this concentration of power that occurs, and because it tends to be those who are wealthier, okay, a lot of times your poorer citizens end up being ignored because decisions are made based on what's popular and what's favorable for your wealthier class. So we talk a lot in this country, especially when it's in social media, about democracy, okay? Anybody, okay? Tell me, what do you understand what a true democracy is? Right, so it is where the people make all the decisions, right? So a lot of times you'll hear people talk in this day and age about how, we're ruining our democracy. The United States is not a democracy, right? What is our government based on? Does anybody know what we call our government? It's a constitutional republic, right? It's not a democracy. And so there are countries still present day that have direct democracies, right? So Switzerland is one of them. If we want to go back to ancient examples, Athens used to be a true democracy, but it's where all the citizens vote on, directly on your laws and your leadership. But where's the downside in that? Can somebody kind of give me what a downside of that would be? Because it sounds great, right? We all get to vote for everything. But when would it not be a good idea? Yes, Dave, tell me.
When too many people get the free stuff.
Yeah. So yes. So what you worry about in a true democracy is that you can get something called mob rule sometimes. Okay. So it's where one idea gets propagated and it can spread like wildfire through a group of people, and they think it's a great idea, okay? And so sometimes you don't necessarily have the wisdom or the foresight to understand the consequences of those actions, right? And so it's why true democracies a lot of times tend to fail. I don't think any of us in this room want to lose our rights or the liberty that we have based on, let's say like what Dave said, a bunch of people coming in that are getting free stuff, simply because you get a majority of the population that decides they think that's what's best, especially if it's just a simple majority, right? And it may not be the wisest decision. And so you have to be very careful when you're talking about democracy. Yes, it sounds great because you think everybody's got equal voice, right? And everybody's got, the ability to participate in every law that's passed. But that's not always the case, okay? I will tell you, when I've been kind of reading throughout the last few weeks about this, especially when I was, reading up on statistics about debate and what, age ranges are most likely to debate which topics and all. One of the things that I found interesting was when you look at, the ages usually between 18 and 30, that they tend to be the most vocal and to vote based on what is their issue right there in that moment. What is affecting them the most in that moment, right? So what's going on in the present? Not, okay, let me think about what's going on, and yes, this may not be what I like, but what could be the potential consequences of this action, right? It's the here and now, okay? It's why you have so many that are in this younger demographic that we see now on the news that are pushing for things like socialism and all, okay? And we'll kind of talk about socialism in a little bit, but it's because the issues that are affecting the younger generation, like right now, okay, things like they're not able to buy homes, okay, like you could 40 or 50 years ago, they don't have affordable health care. A lot of them, once they come off mama and daddy's plans and they have to pay for it for their own, if they don't have a really great job, they don't have health care, right? So when somebody comes to them and starts trying to explain to them, but look at how great socialism is, well, when somebody is promising them that, hey, you're going to be able to have a house and you're going to be able to have health care and you're going to be able to have the things that your mama and daddy and granny and granddaddy have in the here and now, that's all they see, is how it's a solution for them and the problems that are affecting them right now. So again, why you have to be very careful with a true democracy. A republic, on the other hand, like in our case being a constitutional republic, right? It's where the citizens elect representatives, okay? But there's still a constitution that's protecting our rights. And the hope behind that, right, is that when we go to the polls and we elect our representatives, that they're going to be people that are going to be wise and are going to be knowledgeable and are going to make, good decisions for us and be the voice for us. And we know that that's not always what happens, but that's kind of the theory behind it. There's a well-known phrase that after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Ben Franklin was walking out of Independence Hall, and there was a woman that asked him and said, All right, doctor, tell me, what do we have? Do we have a republic or do we have a monarchy? Does anybody know what he said?
Constitutional republic as long as you can keep it.
That's exactly right, right? So he said, a republic if you can keep it, okay? So what do you think that means? What does that mean to you? What does he mean by if you can keep it?
Always somebody trying to take over.
Yeah, so it's a fragile thing, right? So you have this very fragile balance, okay? And what it tells you is that a republic is going to require participation, active participation by its citizens, right? You can't become complacent. If you become complacent, okay, and you allow rulers who are not virtuous or who are corrupt to take over your government and you don't participate in that, you're going to lose your republic, because what's going to happen when you get somebody or a group of people in power that are going to be completely corrupt? What are you going to devolve into? The things that most people are afraid of, right, is tyranny. So you worry about a dictatorship or a tyranny. You get enough people in power, okay, where they have the ability to bend the rule of law, okay, and you have a nation that is not willing to stand up and to defend liberty and to fight for the rule of law, you're going to lose it, right? And so, Ben Franklin recognized that even though we have an extremely well-designed constitution, right, it can still fail. If we as U.S. citizens fail to uphold it, right, so if we become apathetic or if we allow corruption to take over, but not only that, there has to be a moral integrity amongst our citizens. And so, there's a lot of focus, and it has been even since I was a kid in school, right? So more than 40 years ago, about this whole separation of church and state. When you go back and you look at our founding fathers, right? The vast majority, they were Christians, right? Every single signer of the Declaration of Independence, with the exception of one, was an explicit Christian, a very devout, well-spoken out Christian. When we had the original 13 colonies that became the 13 states, you had to actually sign a declaration of faith in order to serve in the U.S. government, okay, for 11 out of the 13 states. So our founding fathers recognized that although they don't believe that that a government should dictate, okay, what religion you practice. We shouldn't have a national religion. They did understand that it was important that we still had to have morals and values and virtues in order for this country to run the way that it runs, right? So moving beyond that, okay, somebody explained to me, and there's lots of versions of this, which I'll kind of break down a little bit briefly, what socialism is. Because if we don't know what it is, how do we know if we're going to vote against it or not, right? So who knows, who can give me a good definition of what socialism is?
Is it a distribution of wealth?
Yes, to a point, okay? So it's where the government owns key industries within a nation, okay? So it's things like they control healthcare. They may control oil and fuel industries, okay? It's where they take over certain industries in order to promote equality, okay? Sweden has a social democracy. If anybody will look up, I know there's going all over social media a graph that I've seen, a comparison talking about, a democratic socialism in Norway. and how it differs as far as your GDP and your crime rate and, you know, how much those people are taxed compared to those within the US versus the services that they get. But in essence, what it's saying is we're going to take, regardless of what the wealth is, okay, regardless of what social class you're in, and we're going to take very key components and make it equal for everyone. Now, where does that become a problem? A couple of different things, right? So, one, you tend to inch into government overreach because the more power that a government traditionally and historically tends to get, the more they want, right? And so you end up with governments kind of, you know, stepping in and taking control of more and more industries. Not only that, you end up with a country a lot of times where their citizens become completely dependent on the government, okay? And so what happens when, and anybody can answer this, when you have a nation where you have some people that are working very hard and some who may not be working as much, but they end up with equal outcomes. Well, if I'm working 80 hours a week and you're working 20 hours a week and we're getting the same thing, I'm going to lose all incentive, right, to work that 80 hours a week. And so you end up with a loss of incentive and a loss of motivation for citizens to do things. And that's always, I think, probably been the biggest, you know, the biggest proponent of people for capitalism is that, you know, if the harder you work, right, the more money you make, the more it drives people to work harder and to do more, and therefore a nation will prosper. What, however, is the difference between socialism now and communism?
Communism owns everything.
That's exactly right, right? So when you have socialism, you can still have some private ownership, okay, of businesses. But in communism, the government controls it all. I was watching a video not long ago by Dennis Prager, who was talking about in the 80s he visited the USSR. And he said it was very odd for him to walk around Moscow and you would see these storefronts, but it would say "Khlyeb," which just means bread. It wasn't Vladimir's bread, right? It just said bread. It was just the bread store. If you saw a restaurant, it was just restaurant. You know, nothing was owned by a private citizen. And so where socialism tries to kind of maintain different social classes, but still make them equal or have equal outcomes, communism wants to remove all classes, okay? It is where the state doesn't just own all of the property and all of the industries, it owns all of the means of production for things as well. And so, like we mentioned just a few minutes ago, you know, if everybody's getting the same, regardless of how hard you work, people tend to do, and it's just human nature, the least that they possibly need to do. Can anybody think of a country that has been wildly popular and successful that's been a communist country? No, because it tends not to happen because they lose their drive, right? And so, yes, you end up with countries like who have your totalitarian rule where you have like North Korea and you have China, but if you look at the individual citizens, okay, none of them are doing particularly well. What then is the difference then? And here's the one that's always going to be thrown out in social media that you guys are going to hear in this day and age. What's fascism? Because if I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times. You're a fascist, you know, talking about people who have conservative values. But how can you defend whether or not you're a fascist if you don't even know what a fascist is? So what's fascism?
fascism is, it's the right wing, right?
Tends to be. They tend to say, yep, very far right. Mm-hmm.
And let's say, it won't say a large centralized government, and it promotes one class over another.
Right. Yes, so you're getting there. So fascism is when you do have this very far right authoritarian, okay, government, but it's very ultranationalism, right? So what is the country that comes to mind, and I think most of us are old enough to remember the country that is associated with fascism? Yeah, Italy and Nazi Germany, right? So, you know, in the 1920s, Italy under Mussolini was your classic fascist state, right? And so, you know, it centralized the power, it suppressed any kind of dissent, it promoted this very aggressive form of nationalism, which is what kind of led them to have this alliance with Nazi Germany. So, what's the difference, though, between Nazi Germany and fascism? Because it's not quite the same.
Well, that was a dictatorship, Nazi Germany.
So Nazi, okay, the term Nazi actually comes from the German word for National Socialism, okay? So whereas fascism tends to be, like I said, very ultra-national, okay? Nazi Germany, although they tried to claim for propaganda purposes that, you know, they were socialist, socialism, like we talked before, kind of preserved classes. You just wanted to be equal. It wasn't the case, though, with Nazi Germany. They were very, you know, race-based. It wasn't class-based, it was very race-based, right? So they felt like the Aryan, you know, nation was superior to all others, and they wanted to just kind of wipe class altogether. Now, interestingly, you could still have private businesses in Nazi Germany, but your private businesses had to be for the benefit of the state. So everything that you did, everything that you produced, right, had to be for the benefit of the state. And so it's where these things kind of get sticky. So then you have to ask yourself, well, why is fascism being, you know, why do we have so much of this trying to equate fascism with conservatism? Why do those on the liberal side or the left side want to say that conservatives are fascist?
Would it be because historically they're right-leaning?
Yes, so they are historically right-leaning, right?
So that's a way to label them.
It's
Conservative.
exactly right. So it is a way to use a pejorative, okay, to label somebody who has different set of values than what you do, okay? And so you end up with what we call this semantic drift, which means you take a word and rather than using it for what it originally meant, now all of a sudden it's encompassing all this stuff other than what the actual historical meaning is. And so, you know, those who tend to be on the more liberal and on the left side, they see conservative values as being a threat to them, right? So whenever, you know, they understand, like most conservatives tend to be, like we talked about, very proud of our nation, okay, as conservatives, whereas your leftists tend not to be proud of the nation, right? Everything's wrong with this country. Things need to change. We need to completely dismantle it and build it back up, you know, the way that we want it. Conservatives, on the other hand, you know, look at it and say, no, we're just trying to preserve our liberties in a very ordered fashion, okay? So in other words, you know, you can kind of do what you want to as long as you're not infringing on my rights, okay? However, what happens is a lot of times when you are talking to someone who tends to have a more liberal viewpoint or perspective, they say, well, that's not right either. You should have to accept, my feelings matter more than, what the actual truth is. And so you end up with a situation where when you're trying to draw boundaries and say, no, that's not what this is, then it becomes, well, you're trying to be an authority, you're trying to take over, you're trying to dictate what I can do. And so that's how this ends up happening. You end up getting this very black and white version of what politics tends to be. So rather than having a lot of gray areas, they want to say, okay, either you're a left or you're right. And if you're right, then we're going to label you a fascist, okay? However, like I said, fascism is kind of a total control over a situation, where conservatism is more of trying to have an ordered liberty amongst things, okay? So what about theocracy? What's a theocracy? And we do still in this modern day and age have theocracies in this world. Yes, that's exactly. Who said that? Who said Iran? Yes, that's right. That's exactly what it is, right? So it's where you have governance that occurs under a religious authority, okay? So if you want to look back in biblical times, ancient Israel under, Moses, and then under judges, and then, the modern example is your Islamic Republic that you have in Iran right now. So, those who live in that country like to say, well, we have this nice, clearly delineated moral framework, okay, that we're going to base our laws on, based on what we believe our God has decided how we need to live our lives, right? But at the same time, the disadvantage of that is it makes it very difficult for anybody who's a minority to be able to live in that country, right? Because you're automatically labeled as, being a sinner, or in cases being, you have hypocrisy that happens within these nations where, what's good for me is not good for you, okay? And you get this abuse of power that happens. So, we know that, God perfectly balances justice and mercy. But when you have human rule kind of taken over and trying to claim that it's under religious authority, humans are fallible. And so they can often corrupt divine law and take things out of context or twist it, okay? What I'm trying to get to in all of these different terms, because there's a lot of them, and next week I'm going to have a nice little sheet for everybody so that you'll have everything that you need to know up to this point on a lot of these definitions, because we're going to need it next week, okay, for the activity that we have, is that, like we've said up until this point, it's very hard for you to engage with someone else, okay, who has differing viewpoints from you if you don't understand where they're coming from, or the terms that they're using, or what they've been taught, okay? And so if you sit down with someone and you're trying to strike up a conversation, and politics or culture comes up, it's not uncommon a lot of times, and I see this on social media constantly, where people want to degrade us as Christians as being some kind of negative, authority in this country that is trying to impinge on the rights of those who have more liberal viewpoints, right? So you can't engage with someone, you can't defend your position if you don't even understand what they're saying to you. If you don't understand the terms, you're never going to be able to get anywhere with them. And like we talked about last week, the only way you're ever going to have a successful discussion with someone who has a different viewpoint from you is if you find common ground somewhere, okay? Somewhere. So you have to understand where they're coming from. Now, how does this relate as far as when we want to talk about how the Bible views government, okay, and how we should all behave. And, the Bible doesn't tell us, hey, you should all be liberals, or you should all be conservatives, you should all be Democrats, you should all be Republicans, right? Because honestly, in John 18:36, it tells us our kingdom is not of this world, okay? But while we're here, we have to make the best of what we can do and try to do the things that we know are to be right. Now, there are some very specific examples, and there's two parables that I pulled that I can think of that kind of will show us how even human governments and human law fail us, okay? The first one I want you to think about is the parable of the Good Samaritan, okay? So thinking back, right, so we have a Jewish merchant who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? And he is robbed, and he's beaten, and he's left on the wayside. There is a priest and a Levite, both of whom come by, right? They're both supposed to be representatives of the religious law, right? But they pass by him. Why? Why does the priest and the Levite, who are the assistants to the priest, right? Why do they pass him by?
Gotta go to church.
He was beneath that.
Yeah.
He was unclean, right? So when you look at him, if you think he's dead, there are very specific rules and rituals that your priests, right, who are the descendants of Aaron's, and your Levites who are the descendants of Levi, as far as who they could touch and what they could do. And so if they lean down to this person who could potentially be dead, what happens if a priest or a Levite touches a dead person? Touching someone that's unclean. They gotta go through this massive ritual, right? To be cleansed again from it. However, then you get a Samaritan, right? Who is, despised by the Jewish society, who is actually the one that stops to help and shows compassion, right? And so that went above and beyond any kind of legal obligation. He didn't have a legal obligation to do that, right? And so the point behind that is that we can all have laws and regulations, okay? But the laws and regulations, they can try to enforce morality, but unless you have someone who's been transformed of the heart, okay, and truly wants to live out a moral life and to live out what the gospel proclaims to us, all the rules in the world aren't going to do you any good, right? The second parable is the parable of the two sons, right? So who remembers the parable of the two sons? Right? So you have a father who instructs two sons to go work in the vineyard, right? So what's the first one do? He refuses to go, right? Refuses to go work in the vineyard, then he thinks about it, and then later decides he's going to obey, right? What happens with the second son? Yeah, the second son says he's going to do it, right? Says, I'll go, but then he never acts, right? And so Jesus is using this to reveal to us that, true obedience is actions speak louder than words, right? And so, again, we can have these governments and these institutions that try to legislate right behavior or profess righteousness publicly, whether it's a theocracy or, when you have a monarchy that is trying to say that they, have had divine power and that's how they're making these decisions. But true obedience to God, right, comes from repentance and from transformation. It's not because the government tells you that that's what you're supposed to do, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, two different questions. One, how can we as believers model mercy that goes beyond just complying with rules and regulations? But not only that, how do our actions that we perform every day reveal whether we serve just the law or whether we're doing things out of love and because that's what Jesus commands us to do, right? And so there are no external systems out there that are going to get us to heaven. no matter the amount of rules and regulations, only the Bible, and following what God tells us to do is going to get us there. So that kind of wraps up all of our terms that we need to learn. Next week we're going to do an activity where we're actually going to kind of go through some basic debate, tactics. And it's not so that you can go out in the world and you can debate everybody, because like we said, it's not about winning arguments. But you do need to understand there's a very fine art to it, to disagreeing with folks, and how we can use this in our discussions with everyday people, and talk about some pretty common topics that tend to be hot-blooded discussions, okay? Any questions, comments? Thanks, y'all. I'm trying to get it all in there real quickly. But.
All right, yeah, y'all give her another hand. She put a lot of work into this.
Thanks.
And so the whole point of doing this was to get us to what's going to happen next week, and to have a mock debate.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tried to find a non-Christian that participates. So I asked Luke if he would. So we're going to get Luke's going to help out, and I think Faith Ledford is going to. So
Fingers crossed, I'm going to ask her. We'll see if she'll come do it. I think she'll be good.
And so I think you'll enjoy that. Hey, Thanksgiving's coming up. Don't we all have that one relative that's hard to talk to? It might be a good opportunity for you to be ready for that conversation wherever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, we'll look forward to that. And then the following week, 2 weeks from tonight, we're really going to be into the capital campaign. And y'all, this campaign is it's not a money-raising campaign. It is a spiritual journey. And so we're going to be focusing on the spiritual aspect of it. And so 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to have a prayer walk. And I've told y'all this before. Whenever I announce that, hey, we're going to have a prayer time next week, my experience has been people. But y'all, this is so important. So don't say, I'm not going to go be a part of that, because I don't know that there's anything we can do greater than to pray for what God's going to do here in our church. All right? And then we'll get back into the book of 1 Samuel. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
It's going to be a lot of fun next week. So y'all come back, bring folks with you. Like I said, it's going to require a lot of participation from folks, and I really think you'll enjoy it.
All right. Let's all stand. Y'all been sitting for a while. Stretch those legs. And I'll close this out in word of prayer. And y'all have a good rest of the evening. And we'll see you Sunday. How about that? Father God, thanks for tonight. Thanks for the hard work that Jamie has put into educating us, Father, so that we can be prepared to defend who we are as Christians, what we believe against the world that may want to try to throw a lot of